Shabbat Shalom. I am going to speak about grief this morning. And before I do that, I want to acknowledge that we have some mourners in our midst. I don't see Celia Schreiber right this moment. She's left the room, but we're holding in our hearts Celia and her whole family, and we're holding Meredith Goldsmith in our hearts today, as their losses are really new. And so my father-in-law died in an ICU in Portland, Oregon on October 7th. And in the last hours of his life, I sat with him chanting psalms, unaware of the horrors that were unfolding for our brothers and sisters in Israel. There's only one breath between life and death. And yet the span between these two states is the single most impenetrable boundary that we encounter. This week's Torah portion offers a kind of prism to turn and turn so we can look at death and its ancillary grief from many different angles. We need Parshat Hukat this year, I think, in a way that we may not have needed it in the recent past. For each of us, in different ways, our grief is more complex, deeper, and more complicated this year than it was perhaps when we read this portion last year. Grief courses through this portion, this parsha. We lose Miriam, of course, and Aaron. And although these are the most noteworthy deaths, I also want to acknowledge that we experience a lot of death in this parsha. The battle with the king of Arad, the people's death by the fiery serpents, and the war with the Amorites, the war with Bashan, the king of Og. So much death and loss. The Bible's style is not always so explicit about grief. For that, we have Midrash. The Bible invites Midrash when it says very little or leaves gaps, as it does in Numbers 20, verse 1. The Israelites arrived, as Ellie chanted so beautifully. Loved listening to your voice chanting this. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Zin on the first new moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. The most remarkable part of these verses is hidden or left out. There almost seems to be an ellipsis in the middle. Miriam died and was buried. But what about the people that she left behind? How did her family mourn? How did the people that she served mourn Miriam? We read that the people begin to grumble and complain against Moses and Aaron just at the time, according to our commentator Abarbanel, when they ought to have comforted Moshe and Aaron for the loss of their sister, the prophetess. To translate this into contemporary language, there was no funeral, no shiva. No one showed up to comfort the mourners. They just buried their sister and showed up at the office the next day. Many have noted the juxtaposition of the lack of mourning rituals described in the wake of Miriam's death with the more elaborate mourning rituals described when Aaron dies. My teacher, Ora Hornprauser, suggests that Moses losing his temper at the rock may be related to complicated grief over the loss of his sister. Perhaps he learned the hard way that public silence about Miriam's loss was a mistake. In Miriam's death, we find a story of inhibited grief, of what happens when we don't have our mourning rituals to ground us, when we are missing this crucial aspect of our spiritual technology. Grief is a generous form of love. Grief is our very human way of praising those whom we love. Grief has as many shades as love does, as fear does. Since October, we have seen and felt so many of these different shades of grief, together and also separately in our own hearts and minds. Grief is a form of praise. Yet we don't see much praise in Hukat. We see lots of complaining. Perhaps the Israelites' protracted grumbling is a result of this inhibited grief they experience upon losing Miriam. They don't have a container for their sadness and their fear, so it spills out as anger. Martin Pretchell, who wrote in his book, The Smell of Rain on Dust, he said that without grief, we can never grow ourselves into real people. He's talking here about being a mensch. Perhaps you can't grow into a proper mensch without experiencing this most human of experiences. In Hukat, Moses is not his best self. He's not acting like a mensch. The people are not acting like mensches. Our Parsha opens with the phrase, Zot Hukat HaTorah Asher Tziva. This is the ritual law that God commanded, describing the esoteric ritual of the red heifer. This mysterious law, described at the opening of our Parsha, requires the ashes of the unblemished red heifer to be combined with mayim chayim, fresh, living water, as part of an elaborate ritual in which the mixture is sprinkled on one who has become impure through corpse contact. What does the red heifer have to do with the other stories of grief in our Parsha? What does the red heifer have to do with our own experiences of grief? Quite a lot, actually, since the red heifer ritualizes death. It is a means of transversing that liminal space between life and death. Death is the most powerful source of impurity in the biblical mind. Purity and impurity are human categories. They do not apply to God, and yet God can only dwell among people when the people are pure. So purity rituals are a means of establishing or reestablishing our relationship to God. Grief, in fact, this paradigm offers another way of thinking about the work of grief. Grief and our rituals surrounding it are our processes for reestablishing this relationship with the sacred. The red heifer rite sounds so strange and foreign to our modern ears, yet it contains the crucial elements that make ritual a powerful means of transmuting our emotions. Ritual works on the nonverbal level. Talking or joy, for that matter, is not a substitute for the rituals that we need to metabolize these experiences. It's no accident that water figures so prominently in our Parsha today and in our rituals. Water plays important roles in the Jewish tradition as it does in other world religions. Water cleanses and purifies. Used in the mikveh, it facilitates change from one state to another. And of course, water figures prominently, water figures in the simple yet powerful act of washing our hands when we're leaving the cemetery. Just as grief runs through our portion, so does water, or the absence of it. The rabbis responded to our gap in the text with the midrash of Miriam's well. As long as Miriam was alive, they said the well followed the Israelites wherever they journeyed. When Miriam died, the well dried up. Commentators have noted that the difference between the Hebrew words Miriam and Mayim is one letter. Velo haya mayim la'ida, and the community was without water. If water is life, Miriam's death is a compounded loss, a loss of one singular life, and also a loss of life writ large, a loss of hope. So if we imagine this story as a needlepoint and we turn it over, we find that water and grief are threads woven together to create this tapestry, a tale of ritual and the lack of ritual. Suddenly, the ashes of the red heifer mixed with mayim, bayim, living water, make sense as a means to transform our grief. It makes sense to juxtapose this esoteric ritual to Miriam's death and to the people's angry thirst. Martin Kretschel, who I mentioned before, is a non-Jewish thinker and writer, and he says that the ocean is the best place to grieve. He suggests that when you experience grief, you should take a trusted friend and travel to the ocean or another body of natural water. The ocean converts all pain to life, he writes. And he imagines that the ocean is a giant womb that gives birth to all life. So the ocean takes every grain of sand or piece of glass or shell or pair of lost sunglasses and melds all these individual grains into the individual pieces of it become sand, which make up the beach. The water of the ocean, he further writes, is salty because it's made up of all the tears, of all the grief of the world's losses since forever. The losses that make up life, not just yours, but also yours. The ocean, he says, is holy and alive and listening. The ocean listens to us and makes room to accept our grief and turn it into new life. Kretschel's creation of a novel ritual to process grief highlighted for me the power of our traditional Jewish rituals, the timelessness and utility contained within our ritual playbook for mourning. There is only one breath between life and death. Yet the span between these two states is the single most impenetrable boundary we encounter. When we do encounter this mysterious and powerful span, we hover in this liminal space of grief. This is the space where words fall short. So we let them go. Instead, we tear our clothes. We feel our hands and the sensation of them as they take the shovel, and we fill a grave with dirt. We cook a meal, we show up for Shiva. We let our rituals hold us up. Shabbat Shalom.